The temperature inside the stone cylinder was 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Exactly freezing. The temperature outside was 34 below zero, a difference of 66 degrees separated by 22 inches of limestone, and the memory of yesterday's fire. Margaret Brennan lay on the dirt floor with her 3 children pressed against her body. Emma, Daniel, Benjamin, 6 years old, 4 years old, 17 months. Their breath came in shallow clouds that hung white in the darkness before dissolving into cold air that should have killed them 6 hours ago. The stove was dead. Had been dead since midnight. The fuel was gone. All of it. Burned through in a desperate race against a storm that had dropped the temperature 50 degrees in 3 hours and killed 235 people across the Great Plains in a single night. But the walls were still giving back heat. Not much. Not the comfortable warmth of an evening fire or the radiant glow of heated stone in October. Just the last thermal memory stored in 900 cubic feet of limestone that had absorbed a day's worth of flame and was now releasing it molecule by molecule into air that wanted nothing more than to match the killing cold outside. Margaret's hand rested against the curved wall. Cool. Not warm. Not even close to warm. But not the deadly negative 34 that was trying to claw its way through the stone. Not yet. The children were breathing. She counted. 1, 2, 3. Benjamin's exhale rattled slightly from the fever that had broken at 7 o'clock the previous evening. But he was breathing. They were all breathing. 32 degrees, the minimum temperature for human survival. The exact point where water becomes ice and blood stays liquid. And 3 children wrapped in every piece of cloth their mother owns can make it through 1 more hour until dawn. She had bought this burned grain silo for $2. Every person in Rush County, Kansas, had calculated she would freeze to death inside it. Every single one. They had used the wrong math. 5 months earlier, the math had been impossible from every angle Margaret could see. July in Kansas territory came with heat that pressed down like a wool blanket soaked in water. The kind of heat that made grown men strip to their waists in the fields and still collapse by noon. The kind that turned sod dugouts into ovens and made children lie listless in whatever shade they could find too hot to play, too hot to cry. Thomas Brennan died on a Tuesday. Cholera took him in 3 days. From a healthy man of 31 who could lift a foundation stone that required 2 other men to shift to a hollowed-out shell that weighed maybe 100 pounds, when Margaret and the neighbor women wrapped him in canvas and lowered him into the ground behind the dugout. The same ground where he had planned to plant apple trees. By Thursday, Margaret had buried her husband and taken inventory of what remained. The inventory did not take long. Assets, $2.40 in a tin box under the floorboards. A homestead claim on a quarter section that required 3 more years of continuous residence and improvement before it would transfer to her name. A sod dugout whose center beam had cracked and whose walls slumped inward a little more with each summer rain. And a foundation, 12 feet by 14 feet. Limestone blocks rising 18 inches above the prairie grass. Cut and laid by Thomas over the course of 2 summers. The beginning of the stone house he had promised her when she stepped off the wagon as a bride of 23. The foundation sat 30 yards from the dugout, unfinished, waiting for walls that would never rise. Liabilities. 3 children. Emma, 6 years old, serious and watchful. Daniel, 4, all energy and questions. Benjamin, 11 months, still nursing, still completely dependent on a mother who now had to figure out how to keep all of them alive through a Kansas winter with $2.40. The mathematics were simple, brutal, undeniable. A Kansas winter required shelter that could hold heat. Her dugout would not survive another season. The center beam was cracked. Each rainfall brought dirt sifting down onto the children's beds. By December, the whole structure would likely collapse inward. Maybe sooner. A Kansas winter required fuel. Wood or coal. 6 to 8 cords of cottonwood for a family of 4 to make it through to spring. The cottonwood had to be hauled 40 miles from the Smoky Hill River at a cost of $3 per cord. $18 to $24 total. Or coal if you could afford it. 2 to 4 tons at $9 per ton. $18 to $36. Margaret had $2.40. A Kansas winter required food stores, flour, dried beans, salted meat, preserved vegetables, enough to last from first frost in October to last frost in April. 6 months. She had 40 pounds of flour and whatever she could grow in her garden plot before September. The numbers did not add up. They did not even come close to adding up. The neighbor women came first. They brought bread and salt pork and advice delivered in quiet voices that nevertheless carried the weight of absolute certainty. Sell the claim. Take the children to Hayes. Find work as a domestic servant. A woman alone cannot prove up a quarter section. The words were kind. The intention was probably kind. But the message was unmistakable. You cannot do this. The neighbor men came next. They came in the afternoon 3 days after the burial, while Margaret was inside the dugout trying to get Benjamin to nurse. She heard them in the yard. Heard the sound of Thomas's tools being loaded into a wagon. The saws, the chisels, the levels and squares, the careful collection of implements he had accumulated over 6 years of homesteading. She came out and found them loading the firewood, 6 cords of cottonwood that Thomas had been hauling and stacking all summer, split and ready for winter, stacked against the north side of the dugout where it would stay dry. What are you doing? Carl. Larson looked up from the wagon bed. He was a big man. Sweat stained his shirt dark across the back. He did not meet her eyes. Thomas would have wanted his neighbors to have use of what he can no longer use, Christian redistribution. The pastor said it was appropriate. They took everything. The tools, the firewood, even the spare harness leather that hung in the dugout's corner. They called it Christian redistribution. They said Thomas would have wanted it this way. They left Margaret with a quarter cord of twisted branches too crooked to split properly, and the clothes on her children's backs. By August, she understood with perfect clarity that the mathematics of her situation allowed for only 3 possible outcomes. 1, she could abandon the claim, walk away from the land Thomas had died trying to prove up, take the children to Hayes, and find work as a domestic servant in someone else's home. The claim would revert to the government. Someone else would file. All of Thomas's work, all of his belief that they were building something permanent here, would dissolve like morning fog. 2. She could accept the community solution. There was a widower, Gottlieb Maas, 4 children of his own, approved claim of 60 acres. He needed a wife. She needed a husband. Reverend Porter had mentioned it twice already. The mathematics of that arrangement were simple, too. Her children would become his children. Her claim would become his claim. Everything Thomas had built would transfer to another man's name. 3. She could try to survive the winter in a collapsing dugout with a quarter cord of firewood and $2.40. The mathematics said option 3 was suicide. Slow suicide that would take 3 children with her when she failed. Margaret stared at those 3 options for 2 weeks, while August turned the prairie grass yellow, and the children asked when they could move into the stone house Papa had promised them. There was no 4th option. The math did not allow for one. Heinrich Kruger arrived on a morning in late August, when the heat was already shimmering off the prairie in waves that made the horizon dance and blur. He was 52 years old, a stonemason who had come to Rush County with the first wave of Volga German settlers in 1876. 12 years of Kansas winters, 11 of them survived by his own skill and calculation. He had built 14 stone houses for families across the county. Good houses, solid houses, houses with walls thick enough to hold heat, and roofs that did not leak, and foundations that would not shift when the ground froze and thawed and froze again, including the foundation that Thomas Brennan had paid him to start and never finished. Margaret met him in the yard. She had rehearsed what she would say. She would offer to work, cooking, cleaning laundry for his family, in exchange for his labor finishing what Thomas had started, raising the walls, building the roof, creating the stone house that would allow her to keep the claim and keep her children, and survive the winter that was coming. Whether she was ready or not, she would offer anything, any terms, any arrangement. Kruger listened. His face showed nothing. When she finished, he walked to the foundation without speaking and examined the stones Thomas had laid. He pressed his palm against the limestone, traced the joints with his fingers, checked the level and the corners, looked out across the prairie where the August grass was beginning to yellow at the tips. He was silent for a long time. "The foundation is solid," he finally said. His voice carried the flat accent of the Volga Germans. Precise, factual. "Your husband was a careful man, 12 by 14 feet. Walls that would have been 20 inches thick. A good, small house. Then you can finish it." Kruger shook his head. "To raise walls and a roof would take 300 hours of skilled labor. Even with your help, I cannot spare the time before winter. I have 2 houses promised already. The Brenner family is waiting for their chimney repair." Margaret had expected this, had calculated this possibility. "I can pay you. In the spring, after the harvest. You have no crop in the ground. I will plant. You have no husband to plant one. You have no equipment, no seed, no draft animals." He looked at her directly now, not unkindly, but with the absolute certainty of a man who had seen enough Kansas winters to know exactly what they required. What will you harvest?" Margaret had no answer. Kruger studied the foundation for another moment. Then he looked at the dugout with its sagging roofline and the dark doorway where 3 children were watching from the shadows inside. "Go to Hayes," he said. "Take the children. Find work as a domestic servant. There are good families there who need help. Your children will eat. You will have a roof that does not leak. And the claim, abandon it. The land will go back to the government. Someone else will file." He paused. "It is only dirt, Mrs. Brennan. It is not worth dying for." Margaret looked at the foundation her husband had laid. The stones were still sharp-edged, not yet weathered by wind and rain and the cycle of freeze and thaw that would eventually smooth them. Thomas had believed they would build a life here. He had believed it until the cholera fever took him. "I cannot leave." Kruger's expression hardened. Not with cruelty, with certainty. The same certainty she had seen in the neighbor women's faces when they told her a woman alone could not prove up a claim. "Then you will die here," he said. The words came flat and final. "A stone foundation is not a house. You cannot raise walls alone. You cannot cut enough fuel. A woman with 3 children and no husband has no business on a claim in winter." He paused. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of mathematical fact. "I have survived 11 Kansas winters. I have built 14 stone houses. I know exactly what winter requires. And I am telling you that what you have here is not enough. The dugout will collapse. You have no firewood. You have no money to buy coal. You have no way to heat a space large enough for 4 people. Another pause. Longer this time. Go to town before the snow comes. Go before you kill those children." He left without looking back. His wagon raised a plume of dust that hung in the still air long after he had disappeared toward the main road. Margaret stood in the yard. The August sun pressed down. Emma came to stand beside her. Small fingers wrapped around her mother's hand. "Is Mr. Kruger gonna finish Papa's house?" "No, sweetheart." "Why not?" "Because he says it is too late. Winter is coming too soon." Emma considered this with the seriousness of a 6-year-old who had already learned that the world did not always make sense. "What will we do?" Margaret looked at the foundation, at the dugout, at the prairie stretching to the horizon in every direction. She did the mathematics again. $2.40. A quarter cord of firewood. A collapsing dugout. 10 weeks until first frost. Maybe less. I do not know yet. Inside the dugout, Benjamin was crying. Hungry again. Always hungry. Daniel was making small roads in the dirt floor with a stick, talking to himself in the language of 4-year-olds that mixed imagination and observation in equal measure. Margaret walked back inside carrying the weight of Heinrich Kruger's certainty like a stone in her chest. 10 weeks until winter. $2.40. 3 children. No options that did not end in failure. That was when she heard about the auction. The sheriff's auction was held on the first Saturday of September in the yard behind the general store in La Crosse, 4 miles from Margaret's claim. A long walk with Benjamin strapped to her back and Emma holding Daniel's hand. But she had heard that auctions sometimes offered tools and lumber for pennies on the dollar. Items that no one else wanted but that might give her one more option than she currently had. A saw, perhaps. Nails. Anything that could extend the life of the dugout or allow her to build some kind of windbreak or storage structure. Anything that might change the mathematics even slightly. The auction drew a small crowd. Maybe 30 people. Farmers looking for equipment they could afford. Merchants looking for inventory to resell at markup in their stores. A few women like Margaret standing at the edges hoping for scraps. The auctioneer was a thin man with a voice that carried across the yard without effort. He worked through the lots quickly, professional, efficient. Each item announced bids taken, sold, money collected. Next item. A plow went for $12, far beyond Margaret's reach. A set of harnesses went for $8, still impossible. A barrel of nails went for $3. She watched it sell to one of the merchants and felt something twist in her stomach. $3. She could have bought that barrel with what the neighbor men had taken as Christian redistribution. She watched each lot pass with a growing certainty that she had walked 8 miles round trip for nothing. Then the auctioneer announced the Morgan property. Margaret knew the name. Everyone in Rush County knew about the Morgans, Carl and Clara, Volga Germans like most of the settlers. They had arrived in 1879 and filed a claim 6 miles north of La Crosse. Built a sod house first like everyone did, then a small barn, then unusual for the area, a stone granary for storing wheat. The granary had taken 2 summers to build. Carl Morgan had been a stonemason in Russia before coming to Kansas. He knew how to cut stone and lay it true. The granary was cylindrical, 18 feet tall, 12 feet in diameter. Walls of native limestone 22 inches thick. It had been built to last 100 years. In the spring of 1887, the barn caught fire. No one knew how. Lightning, maybe, or a lantern knocked over. The flames spread to the house. Carl Morgan died trying to save his horses. His widow Clara salvaged what she could and fled to relatives in Hayes. The claim went to auction for back taxes. The auctioneer described the property in the same efficient voice he had used for the plow and the harnesses. 160 acres of unimproved land. A burned foundation where the house stood. The remains of a barn partially salvaged. And one stone granary with fire damage to the roof. He paused for effect. The granary is intact. Stone walls standing 18 feet high. But the roof burned clean through. Nothing but walls and sky now. Starting bid $5 for the granary and salvage rights to the debris. Silence. $3. More silence. People shifted. Looked at each other. No one raised a hand. $2. Come now, gentlemen. $2 for good limestone walls already standing. Margaret did not know why she raised her hand. The granary was useless. A roofless stone tube standing in the middle of burned wreckage 6 miles from her claim. You could not live in it. You could not store grain in it without a roof. It was a monument to failure. To a man who had died trying to save animals that burned anyway. To a widow who had given up and left. But the walls were 22 inches thick. She had heard that. Everyone had heard that. Carl Morgan had built it the way they built stone structures in Russia. Thick walls. Solid walls. Walls that could stand for a century. 22 inches. Nearly 2 feet of solid stone. $2 to the woman in back. The auctioneer's voice cut through her thoughts. "Do I hear $2.50? Silence. Sold. $2 to Mrs." He paused, looking at her expectantly. "Brennan. Margaret Brennan." She walked forward through the crowd, felt people watching her, heard whispers. That is the Brennan widow, the one with 3 children. What does she want with a burned granary? She paid with coins from the tin box, counted them out carefully. $2 in dimes and nickels and pennies. The auctioneer handed her a deed of salvage and pointed north. 6 miles that way. Property line is marked. Take what you want. Leave what you do not. It is yours now. Margaret walked home with the deed folded in her pocket and 40 cents remaining in the world. Emma asked what she had bought. Margaret did not know how to answer. She had bought a burned stone cylinder with no roof, no floor, no doors, and no purpose. She had bought it because the walls were thick, because something in the back of her mind had stirred when the auctioneer said 22 inches, because she remembered something from childhood that she could not quite articulate, but that felt important in a way she did not yet understand. She had bought it because she had no other options, and $2 seemed like a small price to pay for possibility, even impossible possibility. That night after the children were asleep, Margaret sat outside the dugout and looked at the stars scattered across the black sky. The air had finally cooled, a hint of autumn in the wind that moved through the grass. She thought about the granary standing 6 miles north, a stone cylinder rising out of the prairie like an abandoned chimney, 18 feet tall, 12 feet across, walls 22 inches thick. She thought about Heinrich Kruger's certainty. You cannot raise walls alone. You have no fuel. You will die here. She thought about Thomas's foundation sitting 30 yards away, 12 by 14 feet. Good stone, carefully laid, waiting for walls that would never rise because she had no money and no time and no way to make the mathematics work. And she thought about something else, a memory from childhood, hazy and distant but persistent. Her grandmother's house in Russia, along the Volga River where the Volga Germans had settled generations before some of them decided to come to America. Winters there that dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Winds that killed livestock caught in the open. Cold that could freeze a man solid in the time it took to walk from house to barn. And yet her grandmother's house had been warm. The walls had been thick. Clay brick nearly 3 feet deep. They called the style erde, earth. The walls absorbed heat during the day and released it through the night. Her grandmother had called it Sonnengedächtnis, the sun's memory. On the coldest nights, the walls would be warm to the touch, radiating the heat they had stored when the sun was high. Margaret remembered pressing her palms against those walls as a child, feeling the warmth push back against the cold that screamed outside. The principle was simple. Thick walls held heat the way a clay pot held water. The more mass, the more memory. A thin-walled house lost heat as fast as you could make it. A thick-walled house held yesterday's warmth and gave it back slowly, stretching each fire into hours instead of minutes. Margaret sat in the dark and felt the pieces of an idea beginning to form. Not a complete idea, not even a particularly rational idea, but an idea nonetheless. 22 inches of limestone, 18 feet high. A cylinder. A small space. What if the walls could do the work? What if she did not need to heat a house at all, but only to heat the walls? It was mad. She knew it was mad even as she thought it. A granary was not a house. It had no roof, no floor, no chimney. She would suffocate from smoke or freeze from drafts, or both. Heinrich Kruger would laugh. Everyone would laugh. But the walls were thick, and thick walls remembered. She visited the granary the next morning. The walk was 6 miles each way. She carried Benjamin the entire distance, strapped to her back with a shawl tied around her chest. Emma and Daniel stayed with one of the neighbors, one of the few who would still watch them in exchange for Margaret's promise to bring back any useful boards from the burned barn debris. The granary stood alone on the prairie, a cylinder of blackened limestone rising against the sky like something ancient and abandoned. The roof was gone entirely. Charred timbers had collapsed inward and lay in a heap on the dirt floor. The walls were streaked with soot, the mortar blackened. But the stones themselves were unbroken. Fire did not burn limestone. Margaret walked slowly around the outside. The structure was perfectly circular. The walls stood plumb and true. No cracks, no shifting, no damage except the cosmetic staining from smoke. She stepped through the doorway where the Morgans had once loaded wheat. The interior smelled of ash and old rain. Above her open sky, around her stone walls that had survived a fire that killed everything else, the space was small. She paced it off, 12 feet in diameter, maybe 113 square feet of floor, smaller than the dugout, smaller than any house she had ever seen. She pressed her palm against the stone. Cool. In the September heat, with the sun beating down on the blackened walls, the interior of the stone cylinder was cool. She moved her hand to different spots, all cool. Not cold, but noticeably cooler than the air outside. The walls had absorbed the cold of the previous night and were releasing it slowly, like a clay pot releasing water. Sonnengedächtnis. The sun's memory worked both ways. The walls remembered cold. The walls remembered heat. Whatever you gave them, they held. And whatever they held, they gave back. Margaret stood in the center of the burned granary and began to calculate. A normal cabin, 200 square feet. Thin wooden walls, maybe 4 inches thick. Heat escaping constantly through the wood, through the gaps between boards, through every crack and seam. To keep such a cabin warm through a Kansas winter required burning fuel constantly, all day, all night. More fuel than she could ever gather or afford to buy. This granary, 113 square feet. Stone walls 22 inches thick, more than 5 times the mass of a wooden wall. Heat absorbed slowly, stored in the stone, released slowly. The small space meant less air to warm. The circular shape meant no corners where wind could find cracks and leverage them wider. What if the walls could do the work? What if she did not need to keep a fire burning all day and all night, but only needed to heat the walls? Heat them during the day, let them radiate through the night. 1 fire, maybe 2. Small fires. Controlled fires. Just enough to charge the thermal battery of 900 cubic feet of limestone. The idea was absurd. She knew it was absurd. A granary was not a house. People did not live in grain bins. There was no roof, no floor, no chimney. She would have to build all of that herself with no money, and no help, and no time. Heinrich Kruger had already told her it was impossible. The neighbor women had already decided she would fail. The community had already written her off as a widow who would either remarry or leave. But she had no other options. The dugout was falling. The foundation could not become a house. Widow work in Hayes meant losing the claim, and probably losing her children to separation, when she could not support all three on a domestic's wages. She had $2.40 now. She had a burned stone cylinder 6 miles from her claim. She had a theory about walls and heat and the sun's memory. And she had 3 children who deserved better than the mathematics that said they were all gonna freeze. Margaret looked up at the open sky through the missing roof, looked at the walls rising around her, solid, unbroken, built to last 100 years by a man who understood stone. The math might work. That was better odds than she had anywhere else. She walked home in the afternoon heat with Benjamin sleeping against her back, and a plan forming in her mind. A plan that required salvaging timbers from the burned barn, cutting sod for a roof, somehow creating a chimney through 22 inches of solid limestone, packing a dirt floor, hanging a door, gathering fuel. All of it before first frost. Maybe 10 weeks, maybe less. And all of it alone, but the walls were thick. And if the theory was right, if the sun's memory was real, if limestone could hold heat the way her grandmother's clay walls had held it, then she had a chance. A small chance. A desperate chance. A chance that Heinrich Kruger and everyone else in Rush County would calculate as 0. But it was greater than 0. She was certain of that now. The wolves remembered. And remembering might be enough. The timbers lay scattered across what remained of the Morgan barn, like the ribs of some enormous dead animal, picked and cleaned by scavengers and weather. Most were useless. Fire had cracked them lengthwise or eaten through their centers, leaving fragile shells that crumbled when Margaret pressed her weight against them. But 8 remained solid. She could tell by the sound they made when she struck them with a rock. The blackened exterior looked the same as the others, but the core was sound, dense. The fire had charred the outside, but had not consumed the heart. Each timber weighed more than she did, probably close to 200 pounds. Oak beams that Carl Morgan had hauled from somewhere and shaped for the barn roof, 12 feet long, 10 inches square at the thickest point. Margaret stood in the wreckage and calculated the problem. She could not lift them. That was mathematical fact. She weighed 130 pounds after a summer of eating less so the children could eat more. The timbers weighed 200. Lifting was impossible. But dragging might work. She had rope, 50 feet of it salvaged from the debris pile. Good rope, hemp fiber twisted tight, the kind that held when you needed it to hold. She looped it around the end of the first timber, tied it with the knot Thomas had taught her in their first year of homesteading, the knot that would not slip under load. Then she looped the other end over her shoulders and across her chest like a harness. The angle mattered. She had watched Thomas move heavy stones for the foundation, had seen how he used leverage and rope and the geometry of force distribution. You did not fight the weight directly. You used your body weight as counterbalance and pulled at the angle that gave you mechanical advantage. She leaned forward, felt the rope go taut, felt the timber resist. For a moment, nothing happened. Just tension and the burn of hemp fiber cutting into her shoulders through her dress. Then the timber moved. 6 inches, a foot. The charred end dragging through ash and dirt, leaving a dark furrow in the ground. Margaret kept her weight forward and her feet moving. Small steps. The timber followed, slow, resistant, but following. 1 mile from the Morgan property to the granary, 1 mile back, 2 miles total per timber, 8 timbers, 16 miles of dragging. She made the first trip by noon. Her shoulders were raw where the rope had cut through fabric and skin. Her legs shook from the sustained effort of pulling weight that fought every inch of travel. Emma was waiting at the granary with a jar of water and a cloth soaked in the creek a 1/4 mile east. "Does it hurt, Mama?" Margaret drank half the jar before answering. The water was warm but wet. That was enough. "Yes, but it works. That is what matters." She rested for 20 minutes, long enough for her muscles to stop shaking. Then she walked back to the Morgan barn for the second timber. By evening, she had moved 4. By the end of the second day, 7. The 8th timber she moved on the morning of the 3rd day, and when she finally dragged it into position beside the others at the granary, she collapsed in the grass and lay flat on her back, staring at the sky while her body screamed at her for what she had done to it. Emma brought Benjamin, set him down beside Margaret. The baby crawled onto his mother's chest and settled there content. "We have all the wood now?" Emma asked. "All the good wood, yes. What do we do with it?" Margaret sat up slowly. Every muscle protested. She looked at the 8 blackened timbers lying in the grass, looked at the open sky above the stone cylinder. "We build a roof." The design was simple because it had to be simple. Margaret had no training as a carpenter, no experience building anything more complex than a chicken coop. But she had watched Thomas work, had seen how he thought through structural problems. A circular roof needed a center point, beams radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. The center point had to be strong enough to support the weight of 7 beams meeting at a single junction. The outer ends would rest on the stone walls. She chose the longest timber for the center post, 12 feet of solid oak that would stand vertical in the middle of the granary floor and rise almost to the level of the walls. Digging the hole took half a day. The soil inside the granary was softer than the prairie sod. But 3 feet down, she hit clay that required chipping away with a salvaged shovel blade. When the hole was finally deep enough, she used a board as a lever and a rock as a fulcrum, and shifted the timber upright inch by inch until it stood vertical. Then she shoveled dirt back into the hole and packed it, poured water to settle the soil, packed it again, added rocks from the creek. More dirt, more packing. When she finished, the center post stood 12 feet tall and did not move when she put her weight against it and pushed. The radiating beams were harder. Each one had to span from the center post to the top of the wall. 6.5 feet if you calculated the radius correctly. But the timbers were 12 feet long, which meant she had to notch them where they met the center post and let the excess extend beyond the wall. She had no saw capable of cutting oak. The blade she had salvaged from the Morgan debris was meant for pine boards, and it barely scratched the charred timber surface. So she used fire, controlled fire. Small fire in a trench she dug beneath the spot where the notch needed to be. She fed the fire with twists of dry grass and watched the oak slowly char deeper. When the char was thick enough, she scraped it away with the shovel blade and burned again. It took 2 days to notch 7 timbers. Her hands blistered from the shovel work, the skin peeled, then blistered again underneath. But the notches fit the center post, not perfectly, not the way a trained carpenter would have made them, but well enough that when she levered each beam into position and tied it with rope, the structure held. 7 beams radiating from a center post to the stone walls. The skeleton of an umbrella, crude, blackened, salvaged from destruction, but functional. Daniel stood in the center of the granary and looked up at the spokes meeting above him. It looks like a wagon wheel. It does. Will it hold the roof? It will hold. Or we will fix it until it does. The sod came from the prairie a 1/4 mile from the granary. The grass there grew thick with roots that penetrated 18 to 24 inches into the soil. Dense mat of fiber and earth that held together when you cut it. Margaret used a spade with a narrow blade. Cut rectangles 2 feet long by 1 foot wide. The depth varied. Wherever she could get the blade to penetrate. 6 inches, 8, 10 in places where the roots went especially deep. Each rectangle weighed close to 40 pounds. Wet earth, tangled grass roots, heavy in a way that made her arms shake after cutting just 3 or 4 pieces. She built a cart to haul them, salvaged barrel staves for the frame, wagon wheels from the Morgan debris, rope lashing to hold it together. The cart was ugly and unbalanced and squeaked with every revolution, but it held 6 pieces of sod, and that was enough. 6 pieces per trip, 1/4 mile each direction. She lost count of how many trips she made. 30 maybe. 40. Enough that the path from granary to cutting site wore into a visible track through the prairie grass. Emma helped cut sometimes. Her small hands could manage the spade for shallow cuts. Daniel brought water and kept Benjamin entertained with grass stems and stones while Margaret worked. The laying technique came from memory, from watching sod houses go up during her first years in Kansas. Grass side down, overlap the edges like shingles so water runs off instead of soaking through. Press each piece firmly against the ones beside it. The work was back-breaking. The sod was wet from recent rain, which made it heavier but also more pliable, easier to shape around the beam framework. Margaret climbed onto the stone walls to position the outer edges, stood on boards balanced across the beams to lay the interior sections. The roof grew slowly, a few square feet per day, sealing the granary piece by piece against the sky. Her hands cracked and bled. The skin split across her palms where calluses had formed and then torn away. She wrapped them in cloth strips, but the cloth soaked through with blood and had to be changed twice a day. 3 weeks of cutting and hauling and laying. 3 weeks of muscles that screamed and hands that bled, and a back that felt like it might break if she bent one more time to lift one more piece of heavy earth. But the roof was complete, lumpy, sagging slightly between beams, grass growing from it in patches where the seeds in the sod had found enough moisture to sprout. But complete. The first autumn rain came on a Wednesday morning. Soft rain, steady. The kind that would have leaked through the dugout roof in a dozen places. Margaret stood inside the granary and watched water run off the sod roof and into the grass outside. The interior stayed dry. Not a drop came through. She had built a roof, alone, with salvage materials and no training and hands that were more scab than skin. The roof held. The chimney was a different problem entirely. Stone did not cut easily. Limestone was softer than granite, but it was still dense mineral that resisted tools designed for wood. And she needed to create an opening through 22 inches of it, 8 inches in diameter. High enough above the floor that the stove could draw properly, but low enough that she could reach it to work. She chose a spot 8 feet up on the north wall, marked a circle with charcoal, stared at it for a long time, calculating the impossibility. An inch per day would be optimistic. 22 inches meant 22 days of work. First frost usually came in mid-October. She was already into September. The mathematics were brutal, but there was no other option. A fire without a chimney would fill the granary with smoke. She would suffocate before she froze. She began chipping. The tools were wrong. A household hammer. A kitchen chisel salvaged from the dugout. Not proper mason's tools. Not star drills or stone chisels or any of the equipment Heinrich Kruger would have used. But they were what she had. She built a ladder from barn boards, leaned it against the wall, climbed up with hammer and chisel and began striking the limestone at the edge of her charcoal circle. The first day she penetrated half an inch. The sound echoed inside the stone cylinder. Hammer on chisel, chisel on stone. A rhythm that became hypnotic after a while. Strike, chip, brush away the dust. Strike again. Her hands blistered within the first hour. The blisters broke. The raw skin underneath bled. She wrapped cloth around her palms and kept working. By the end of the second day, she had penetrated perhaps an inch and a half. The mathematics were becoming clearer. 22 inches at this rate meant something close to 40 days of work. She did not have 40 days. On the morning of the 5th day, Friedrich Weber found her. He was 67 years old, stooped, weathered, hands gnarled from a lifetime of working stone. He had been a master stonemason in Russia before coming to Kansas, had worked with Thomas on the foundation during the first summer, had not spoken to Margaret since the funeral. He stood in the doorway of the granary and watched her work. She was on the ladder, striking the chisel with mechanical determination. Blood soaked through the cloth wrapped around her left hand. The hole she had made was perhaps 3 inches deep. A pathetic dent in 22 inches of limestone. Margaret did not notice him until she climbed down to move the ladder to a different angle. She turned and he was there, silent, studying the wall with a professional's eye. "Mr. Weber," he nodded, walked to the wall without speaking, examined the hole she had made, ran his fingers over the surface, tested the depth with a knuckle. "You are doing this wrong." Margaret felt something tight form in her chest. Another man come to tell her she was failing. "I know it is slow, but I am making progress. You need to drill guide holes first, then cut between them. The way you are doing it now will take 2 months. He turned and looked at her directly. Do you have 2 months? No. I thought not. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the wall, at the crude ladder, at the woman with bleeding hands who was trying to accomplish something that should have required professional tools and professional knowledge. I have the proper tools at my house, a star drill, a heavier hammer. I do not have money to pay. Thomas was my friend. We laid stone together. Good stone. He paused. Watching his widow destroy her hands on work she does not understand is more than I can bear. He walked to the doorway, stopped. I will come tomorrow afternoon. I will show you how it is done. Then you will finish it yourself. People will talk, but people already talk. They say you are mad. Perhaps they are right. He left before she could respond. He arrived the next afternoon carrying a canvas bag of tools. Star drill, stone hammer, proper mason's chisel. He did not greet her, just climbed the ladder and began working. The star drill was designed for exactly this purpose. 4 cutting edges arranged in a cross pattern. You struck it with the heavy hammer, rotated it a quarter turn, struck again. The rotation prevented the drill from binding. The weight of the proper hammer drove it deep. Weber worked with the efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times. 4 hours. That was all. 4 hours of drilling guide holes in a careful pattern around the perimeter of the circle. Then, switching to the chisel to cut the stone between the holes. The limestone came away in chunks instead of dust. When he climbed down from the ladder, there was a hole through the wall, 8 inches in diameter, 22 inches deep, angled slightly upward to create draft. What had taken Margaret 5 days to barely start, Weber had completed in an afternoon. The angle is critical, he said, packing his tools. Too flat, and the smoke will not draw. Too steep and heat is wasted. 15 degrees is optimal. How did you measure 15 degrees without? You do not measure. You learn. After 40 years, you know. He shouldered the canvas bag. Thomas would have done the same for my wife. This is not charity. This is debt. He walked away across the prairie. Margaret watched him until he disappeared over a low rise. She climbed the ladder and pressed her hand against the opening, felt the air movement, the natural draw created by the angle and the height and the geometry of heated air rising. A chimney through 22 inches of limestone. She had a roof. She had a chimney. The mathematics were starting to shift. Reverend Samuel Porter arrived on a Sunday afternoon in mid-September. He drove a black wagon and wore a black coat, and had the expression of a man performing an unpleasant duty required by his position. He was 58 years old, had led the Lutheran congregation in Rush County since 1877, considered himself the moral guardian of the community. Widows were problems to be solved. Women without husbands were disruptions to the natural order. Margaret was outside the granary working on the doorframe when she saw him coming. She did not stop working, did not go to meet him, just kept planing the edge of a board salvaged from the Morgan barn until it fit the opening properly. Porter climbed down from the wagon. stood in the yard looking at the stone cylinder with its lumpy sod roof and the smoke hole visible on the north wall. "Mrs. Brennan, Reverend, I have come to speak with you about your situation." Margaret set down the plane, wiped sawdust from her hands. The cuts were scabbed over now, starting to heal, but the skin was still raw in places. "My situation is that I am preparing for winter, same as everyone else. Your situation is that you are a widow with 3 children attempting to survive alone on a homestead claim. That is not the same as everyone else." He moved closer, looked at the granary, at the door frame she was building, at the evidence of work that should have been impossible for a woman without help. "I have a solution for you. His name is Marcus Webb." Margaret had heard this before, twice from neighbor women, once from Porter himself at Thomas's funeral. She did not respond. "Marcus is a good man, a widower with 4 children. He has a proved claim, 60 acres, a sod house, a stone barn. He needs a wife. You need a husband. This is how God solves problems. I have a claim to prove up. Marcus has a claim already proved. You would be comfortable there. Your children would be cared for. My children would be his children. They would be safe, fed, warm through the winter." Porter's voice took on the tone he used from the pulpit. Reasonable, authoritative, final. "Mrs. Brennan, a woman alone cannot prove up a quarter section. You know this. Everyone knows this. What you are attempting here," he gestured at the granary, "this is pride. Sinful pride." Margaret picked up the plane again, examined the board edge. Still needed another pass to fit flush. "What happens to my claim if I marry Marcus Webb?" "It returns to the government. Someone else files. The land is not lost. It simply passes to another family. Thomas's work passes to another family. Thomas is dead, Mrs. Brennan. The dead have no claims." Margaret set the board in the doorframe. It fit now. She reached for a nail. "I am not marrying Marcus Webb." Porter's expression shifted. The pastoral concern hardened into something else, something that had been waiting underneath. "I've heard about your project here. People are talking. They say you plan to live in this." He looked at the granary with open disdain. "A grain bin, a stone tube with a grass roof. This is madness. It has walls, a roof, a chimney. That is more than many homesteaders start with. It is an abomination. God took your husband for a reason, perhaps to teach you humility, perhaps to show you that a woman's place is not alone on a claim, but beside a man who can provide." Margaret drove the nail. 3 strikes. The board held. "God did not take my husband. Cholera did. And who sends disease but the Lord?" She had no answer to that. Was too tired to argue theology with a man who had never buried a spouse, never worked a field alone, never wondered if his children would survive the winter. Porter stepped closer, close enough that she could smell tobacco on his breath. "Marcus Webb has offered a generous arrangement. He will raise your children as his own. They will have food, shelter, safety." A pause. "If you die in this foolishness, Mrs. Brennan and you will die as surely as winter follows autumn. Your children will be orphans. The church will place them with families who need labor. He let that sink in. Emma will go to one house, Daniel to another, Benjamin to a third. They will be separated. They will never see each other again. The threat was clear, explicit. If she failed, he would personally ensure her family was destroyed. Margaret set down the hammer, looked at him directly. I will not fail. Porter smiled, thin, patient. The smile of a man who had seen widows break before and knew he would see this one break too. Pride comes before the fall, Mrs. Brennan. I will pray for you. And when the cold comes and you find yourself in need of Christian charity, I trust you will remember who offered it first. He climbed back into the wagon and drove away. Margaret stood in the yard. Inside the granary, Emma was playing with Daniel, keeping him quiet. But she had heard. Margaret knew she had heard, because Emma came to the doorway with her serious 6-year-old face and fear in her eyes. Mama, are we going to be separated? Margaret knelt, pulled her daughter close. No, never. I promise. It was a promise she had no mathematical right to make. Porter was correct about what would happen if she failed. The community that had abandoned her in life would claim her children in death, split them apart, send them to different families where they would work until they were old enough to leave. She would not fail. She could not fail. 7 weeks until first frost. The granary had a roof and a chimney and a door frame. She still needed to gather fuel, still needed to set up the interior, still needed to test whether the theory about thermal mass and the sun's memory was anything more than desperate hope. 7 weeks, 3 children, a stone cylinder that everyone calculated would be their tomb. Margaret went back to work. By the end of September, the interior was transformed. Thomas's box stove sat in the center of the circular space. Cast iron, 24 inches wide, 18 inches deep. Salvaged from the dugout along with the stovepipe that now rose through Weber's chimney hole and extended 3 feet above the roof. The dirt floor had been packed smooth. Margaret had hauled water from the creek and poured it on the bare earth, then tamped it with a flat board weighted with stones. Pour, tamp, let it dry. Pour again. The process took days, but the result was a floor nearly as hard as wood, smooth enough to walk on barefoot, solid enough to support furniture. Not that she had much furniture. Straw mattresses lined the curved walls. One for Margaret and Benjamin, one for Emma and Daniel. Blankets hung on rope to separate the sleeping areas and provide some insulation against drafts. Rope shelves held their supplies. 40 pounds of flour in a sack. Dried beans. Preserved vegetables that Margaret had traded labor to obtain from neighbors who still spoke to her. Glass jars sealed with wax. Not much. Not nearly enough. But something. And against the wall opposite the door, the fuel pile. Cow chips gathered from the prairie where cattle had grazed and deposited their contribution to the ecosystem. The chips dried hard in the sun, burned slow and steady, put off less heat than wood, but lasted longer. Margaret had walked miles gathering them, filled baskets, hauled them back to the granary, stacked them like bricks against the stone wall. Twisted hay formed the second layer, bundles of prairie grass twisted tight and tied with string. The Volga Germans had used them in Russia when wood was scarce. They burned fast but hot, good for starting fires or boosting heat when needed. And a few scraps of wood, boards from the Morgan barn, broken furniture from the dugout, kindling split from branches collected along the creek. All of it together measured out to perhaps the equivalent of 2 cords of firewood. Maybe a little more if she was generous with the calculation. A normal family needed 6 to 8 cords to survive a Kansas winter. Margaret was gambling that the walls would make the difference. On the evening of October 23rd, the first frost came. Margaret saw it forming in the late afternoon, the temperature dropping, the sky clear. The kind of evening that meant ice by morning. She lit the first fire in the stone granary that night. The children watched as she arranged kindling in the stove, twisted hay underneath, cow chips stacked carefully on top. She struck a match. The hay caught. The kindling followed. The chips began to smolder. The stove door closed. The draft adjusted. Smoke rose through the pipe and out into the darkening sky. The interior temperature was 43 degrees. Cold enough to see breath. Cold enough that the children huddled under blankets. Margaret had made a thermometer from a glass tube and mercury that she had traded for in town. Hung it on the wall. Watched the silver line. 1 hour after lighting the fire, the temperature had risen to 50 degrees. The air was noticeably warmer. Not comfortable yet, but warmer. The children pushed their blankets down slightly. By 9 o'clock, the interior measured 54 degrees. Margaret fed the stove. Small amounts, controlled feeding. Not trying to create a roaring blaze, just maintaining steady heat. Letting the walls absorb. She pressed her palm against the limestone. The stone was warm, not hot, not uncomfortable to touch, but warm, radiating. At midnight, the stove had burned down to embers, barely alive. Margaret did not add more fuel, just let it coast. Watch the temperature, 55 degrees. The walls were doing the work. She could feel it. Heat radiating from 900 cubic feet of limestone that had spent the evening absorbing energy from the fire and was now releasing it back into the air. By morning, the fire was completely dead. No coals, no heat from the stove itself. Outside, frost painted the prairie white. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees during the night. Inside the granary, the thermometer read 48 degrees. The interior had dropped only 7 degrees overnight, with no fire. The walls had given back what they had stored. Emma woke up and looked around. "It is not cold, Mama." "No, sweetheart, it is not cold." Margaret climbed out from under the blankets and relit the fire. Small fire. Just enough to bring the temperature back up and recharge the wolves for another cycle. The system worked. In October, at least. But October was not January. November brought the first real test, mid-month. A cold snap that dropped temperatures to 5 below zero. Wind at 40 miles per hour driving snow horizontal across the prairie. 2 miles east, the Larson family fought for warmth in their frame cabin. 320 square feet. Pine walls 4 inches thick. Carl Larson fed wood to the stove as fast as he could split it. The fire roared. Heat poured up the chimney, but the thin walls could not hold it. The warmth escaped as fast as it was created. By evening, frost formed on the inside of the windows. The interior walls wore coats of white ice crystals. Ingrid Larson heated bricks on the stove, wrapped them in cloth, placed them in the children's beds to stop the shivering. Carl burned a quarter cord of wood that night, exhausting their supply at a rate that would leave them with nothing by January. At the stone granary, Margaret lit the fire at dusk. The interior temperature started at 52 degrees. The walls had been pre-warmed by days of careful heating. The limestone held yesterday's heat, and the day before that. Building thermal reserve. As the exterior temperature dropped, Margaret fed the stove steadily, not frantically. Controlled, measured, maintaining the fire but not driving it beyond what the space required. By midnight, it was 5 below zero outside. Inside the granary, the temperature read 46 degrees, 6 degrees of drop despite extreme cold. The circular walls deflected the wind, no corners for it to grip and leverage. The shape shed the gust like a river stone sheds water. The children slept comfortably under their blankets. No shivering, no frost forming on interior surfaces, no desperate measures required. Margaret burned perhaps 1/10 of a cord that night. Less than the Larsons despite having a smaller, harder-to-heat space on paper. The walls were proving the theory. Heinrich Kruger heard about it from Friedrich Weber 3 days later. The Brennan widow was surviving. Her stone bin was holding heat like nothing Weber had seen before. Kruger did not believe it. He walked 3 miles through snow that was still piled in drifts from the cold snap, stood outside the granary watching smoke rise from the chimney. Steady smoke. Not the desperate black plume of a fire being driven beyond efficient burning. He did not knock, just stood there in the cold looking at a structure that should not have worked. That violated everything he knew about heating spaces through Kansas winters, but it was working. He had built 14 stone houses in Rush County. Good houses with thick walls and proper construction. None of them held heat the way this salvaged grain bin apparently did. The difference was not the material. Limestone was limestone. The difference was the shape, the size. The thermal mass concentrated in a small space, circular instead of square, small instead of large. 22 inches of stone absorbing and radiating in a way that his larger rectangular houses could not match. Kruger walked home through the snow with doubt eating at the certainty he had felt when he told Margaret Brennan to abandon her claim. Maybe she would still freeze. January was coming. Real cold. Sustained cold. But maybe she would not. The calculation that had seemed so absolute in August was starting to show cracks. By late December, Margaret's fuel pile was half depleted, but it had depleted slower than she had feared. The walls were working better than the original theory had predicted. She was burning roughly half what a normal cabin would require. The temperature inside the granary held between 45 and 55 degrees most days. Cold enough to need blankets at night, warm enough to function during the day. The children adapted, played games that kept them moving, helped gather cow chips from the edges of the cleared area around the granary. Daniel learned to twist hay into tight bundles. Emma learned to bank the fire for overnight burning. They were surviving. And then Benjamin started coughing. It began in the first week of January, a small cough, wet, the kind that came with winter colds. Margaret was not worried at first. Children coughed. Winter meant coughs. He would recover, but the cough worsened. By January 10th, Benjamin was running a low fever. By January 11th, he could not nurse without coughing so hard. He choked. His breathing came in ragged gasps. His lips had a bluish tinge that terrified Margaret in a way the cold and the fuel shortage and the community's condemnation had not. She held him through the night, counting breaths, measuring the space between each rattling exhale, praying for morning to bring improvement. Morning brought warmth instead. January 11th dawned clear and mild. The temperature rose to 32 degrees, above freezing for the first time in weeks. The snow began to melt. Water dripped from the sod roof. The prairie turned to mud. Benjamin's fever eased slightly. He nursed without coughing, fell asleep against Margaret's chest with breathing that sounded almost normal. Margaret stepped outside to take advantage of the thaw. The fuel pile outside needed inventory. She wanted to gather the last scattered cow chips from the area before the next snow buried them. The children played in the mud, Emma and Daniel laughing, making small channels for water to run through. The first laughter Margaret had heard in weeks. The sky to the northwest was clear. The wind was calm. The air felt like spring. It was January 12th, 1888, 11 o'clock in the morning, and 70 miles to the northwest, moving at 40 miles per hour. A wall of Arctic air was racing south with the force of mathematical inevitability. Margaret was 50 yards from the granary, bent over the last scattered fuel when the sky changed. One moment blue and clear. The next, a black line on the horizon, growing, moving faster than seemed possible. She straightened, looked northwest. The black line was a wall now, solid, advancing. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the time it took her to realize what was happening. She ran for the granary, shouted for Emma and Daniel. The wind hit her like a fist, physical force that knocked her sideways. She went to her knees in mud that was already freezing solid beneath her. The blizzard had arrived. The snow came horizontal, not falling from the sky, but driving parallel to the ground like white bullets fired from the northwest. Visibility dropped to zero in the time it took Margaret to crawl 10 yards. She could not see the granary, could not see her hands in front of her face, could only feel the wind tearing at her clothes and the cold that turned exposed skin to fire. She crawled, hands and knees in mud that was transforming to ice beneath her palms. Her fingers found stone. The curved wall of the granary rising out of the white chaos. She followed it around to the doorway, pulled back the blanket that served as a temporary door and fell inside. The children were screaming. Emma had pulled Daniel and Benjamin into the center of the floor space, away from the walls, and was holding them both while the wind shrieked through gaps around the doorframe. Snow drove in through every crack, white streamers across the dirt floor. The temperature was already dropping. Margaret sealed the door as best she could, stuffed rags into the gaps, pressed blankets against the frame, used boards and rope to block the wind that fought to enter with physical force. The stove was cold. She had let the fire die during the mild morning. There had been no reason to maintain it when the temperature outside was above freezing, and Benjamin's fever had finally broken. Now she fumbled for kindling with fingers that were already going numb. Struck a match. The flame blew out instantly from the drafts still finding their way through the door seal. She struck another. Another. Cupped her hands around the flame. Fed it a twist of hay. The hay caught. She added kindling. A cow chip. Another. The fire was reluctant. The wood was cold. The chips were cold. Everything was cold. On the fifth match, the kindling finally caught and held. She fed it carefully, built the fire up from reluctant spark to actual flame. Added chips until the stove was drawing properly and smoke was rising through the chimney. The interior temperature when the storm hit had been 52 degrees. The walls had been warm from days of careful heating. Thermal mass charged and ready. Margaret hung the thermometer where she could see it and began tracking what was happening. 11:30. Exterior temperature 0 degrees Fahrenheit. A 32-degree drop in 30 minutes. Interior holding at 50 degrees, noon. Exterior 15 below. Interior 48 degrees. The cold was overwhelming the system. Heat was escaping through the roof, through the door, through every imperfection in the structure. Faster than the walls could compensate. Despite the fire now blazing in the stove, the interior was dropping. Margaret fed more fuel. 2 chips at a time instead of 1. The flames roared higher. The stovepipe rattled with the draw. Benjamin was burning with fever again. The sudden temperature change had triggered something. His small body rigid against Margaret's chest. His skin hot enough that she could feel the heat through her dress. The cough that had eased during the mild morning was back with force. Each breath a rattling struggle that shook his entire frame. He needed warmth. The fever needed to break. But the storm was demanding fuel at a rate that would exhaust their supply in hours instead of days. Margaret made the only calculation she could. Save the child first. Deal with the consequences later. She stoked the fire higher. Fed chips steadily. Brought the interior temperature up despite the killing cold that pressed against the walls from outside. 2 o'clock. Exterior 22 below 0. Interior 46 degrees despite the fire blazing. The fuel pile was shrinking visibly. What should have lasted days was being consumed in hours. The pile outside was unreachable, buried under snowdrifts that were piling 4 feet deep against the north wall. Invisible in the white darkness that had swallowed the world. Whatever fuel she had inside was all she would have until the storm passed. And blizzards on the plains could last 3 days. Margaret did the mathematics. Current consumption rate, half the interior fuel gone in 3 hours. At this pace, complete depletion by midnight. The storm had hit at 11. That gave her 13 hours of fuel. Maybe 14 if she rationed carefully. But rationing meant letting the temperature drop. And letting the temperature drop meant risking Benjamin's fever spiking again. Meant risking all 3 children to hypothermia. She chose her child over the mathematics. 4 o'clock. Exterior 25 below 0. Interior holding at 48 degrees, but only because the fire was being driven beyond efficient burning. Margaret climbed on a barrel to push the stovepipe back into alignment when a gust threatened to tear it loose from the chimney. Her hands were raw, The metal was hot enough to raise blisters through the cloth she wrapped around her palms. 5 o'clock. Benjamin's fever spiked. He woke screaming, body arched, rigid. Temperature so high that Margaret could feel heat radiating off him, like he was a coal pulled from the fire. She stripped him naked, bathed him with water from the drinking bucket, tepid water that felt cold against his burning skin, held him, rocked him, sang the songs her grandmother had sung in Russia, songs about rivers and forests and homes that stayed warm through the coldest nights. The fever broke at 7 o'clock. Benjamin went limp in her arms, soaked with sweat. His breathing eased. When he opened his eyes, they were clear for the first time in days. When he reached for her breast, he nursed without coughing. Margaret wept. Silent tears that froze on her cheeks in the cold air. Her baby was alive. The crisis within the crisis had passed. But the storm had not passed, and the fuel was almost gone. 8 o'clock. Exterior 28 below zero. Interior 40 degrees. Margaret stopped feeding the stove. She had perhaps a dozen chips left, a handful of twisted hay, a few scraps of wood. If she burned them now, she would have warmth for 2, maybe 3 hours. Then, nothing. If she saved them, the temperature would drop. But the walls would continue to radiate the heat they had absorbed during the day. Not much heat. Not the comfortable warmth of an evening by the fire. Just the thermal memory stored in 22 inches of limestone that had spent 8 hours absorbing energy and would now release it slowly through the night. She banked the fire to embers. Minimal airflow. Just enough to keep coals alive, but not consuming fuel. Then she wrapped her children in every piece of cloth they owned. Blankets, spare dresses, Thomas's old shirts. Everything. They huddled together on the floor in the center of the room, the spot equidistant from all walls where the radiant heat from the stone would converge. Margaret pressed Benjamin against her chest, pulled Emma and Daniel tight against her sides, covered them all until only their faces showed. The stone walls breathed heat into the room, not blazing heat. Not the comfortable warmth of October evenings, but heat that came from the stones themselves, from the 900 cubic feet of limestone that had absorbed a day's worth of fire, and were now giving it back molecule by molecule. 10 o'clock. Exterior 30 below zero. Interior 34 degrees. The fire was dead, except for the faintest glow of coals. Midnight. Exterior 32 below zero. Interior 32 degrees. Exactly freezing. The temperature where water becomes ice and blood stays liquid. The minimum temperature for human survival. Margaret lay awake. She could see her breath clouding white in the darkness. Could hear the wind screaming outside. Could feel the cold pressing against the walls like something alive and malevolent, trying to claw its way through the stone. But the walls were still warm. Not warm the way they had been in November. Not even cool warm the way they had been an hour ago. But not the deadly 32 below that raged outside. The limestone was giving up its final reserves. The last thermal memory from a fire that seemed like it had burned days ago, instead of hours. She reached out from under the blankets and pressed her palm against the stone. Cool, almost cold, but not killing cold. Not yet. The children were breathing. She counted. Emma, Daniel, Benjamin. 1, 2, 3. Shallow breaths that came with effort, but came nonetheless. 32 degrees. The exact mathematical minimum. The walls had calculated it perfectly. 2 miles to the east, the Larson family was fighting a different battle. Their frame cabin measured 16 feet by 20 feet. 320 square feet of space enclosed by pine walls 4 inches thick. When the blizzard hit, Carl Larson had been prepared. He had wood stacked. He had experience with Kansas winters. He knew what to do. He burned the woodpile, fed the stove constantly, kept the fire roaring. Heat poured into the cabin and escaped just as fast through the thin walls, through the gaps between boards, through every crack and seam that expansion and contraction had opened over 6 years of freeze and thaw. By evening, ice formed on the inside of the windows. Frost covered the interior walls in delicate white patterns that would have been beautiful if they had not represented heat loss. Heat that was costing them their winter fuel supply at an unsustainable rate. Ingrid heated bricks, wrapped them in cloth, placed them in the children's beds. The bricks helped, but they were treating symptoms, not solving the fundamental problem. The cabin could not hold heat. By midnight, Carl had burned through the woodpile. He moved to the fence posts stacked behind the cabin, split them, fed them to the fire. The posts were green. They burned reluctant and smoky, but they burned. At 1 in the morning, he burned 2 chairs. At 2, the table that had belonged to Ingrid's mother, brought from Sweden, carried across an ocean and half a continent. It burned faster than the fence posts, dry hardwood that had been furniture and was now fuel. The interior temperature held at maybe 20 degrees, cold enough that frost covered everything, cold enough that the children huddled together for warmth, despite the fire roaring in the stove. At 2:30, Carl Larson looked at his wife across the cabin and saw the same calculation forming in her eyes. They were out of fuel. The temperature outside was dropping toward the coldest reading of the storm, and their children were starting to shiver in a way that would not stop. He went to the lean-to where their milk cow stood. The animal was their livelihood. Milk for the children, butter to trade in town. The foundation of their survival in this place. You did not kill your milk cow unless you had no other choice. Carl slit the animal's throat, used his knife with the efficiency of a man who had butchered livestock before. The cow collapsed, blood spreading dark across the straw. He opened the carcass, made space inside. The family crawled into blood and viscera that was still warm with the heat of a dying animal. The children were crying. Ingrid was silent. Her face showed nothing. The blankness of someone who had gone beyond shock into a place where feeling was impossible. They huddled inside the body of the cow while the cabin temperature dropped to 10 below zero around them. The cow saved their lives, but it cost them everything they would need to survive the spring. No milk, no butter, no income. Just survival measured in hours, bought with the sacrifice of their future. At the stone granary, Margaret listened to the wind and counted her children's breaths and waited for dawn. It came at 6 o'clock. Gray light filtered through the gaps around the door. Weak, reluctant, but light nonetheless. The temperature outside was 34 below zero. The coldest reading of the storm. the point where exposed flesh froze in minutes and breath turned to ice crystals before it could dissipate. Inside the granary, the thermometer read 32 degrees. The walls had given everything they had. The thermal mass was exhausted. The limestone was now the same temperature as the air. The system had reached equilibrium. No more heat to give. No more reserves to draw on. But it had been enough. The children were breathing. 32 degrees was cold. Cold enough to require every blanket they owned. Cold enough that Margaret's hands were stiff and clumsy when she tried to move. But not cold enough to kill. She fed the last chips to the stove, coaxed a small flame back to life. The heat felt like resurrection, like grace, like mathematical proof that impossible things could happen if you calculated the variables correctly. Within an hour, the interior had climbed to 40 degrees. Within 2 hours, 45 degrees. The walls began absorbing again, drinking in warmth, preparing to give it back when the next cold night came. The thermal battery recharging. Margaret opened the door. The world outside was white and silent. Snow lay 4 feet deep where the wind had piled it against the curved wall of the granary. The drifts extended in ripples across the prairie like frozen waves. Nothing moved. The wind had stopped. The storm had exhausted itself. What remained was just cold. Pure cold. Mathematical cold. 34 below zero under a clear sky. The shape of the fuel pile was gone. Buried. It would take days to dig out what remained. Margaret stood in the doorway with Benjamin in her arms. Emma appeared beside her. Then Daniel. 3 children who should have been dead. Who every calculation said should have frozen in a grain bin with no fire and no heat, except what 22 inches of limestone could remember from yesterday's sun. But they were alive. The walls had held. Heinrich Kruger came on the 3rd day after the storm. The roads had been broken by men with teams of horses dragging logs to pack the snow. The dead were being counted. 235 people across the Great Plains. Children who had frozen walking home from school. Women found in drifts 50 feet from their front doors. Entire families who had not survived the night. Kruger drove his wagon slowly. The horse was cautious on the packed snow. He did not announce himself when he arrived at the granary, just stood outside for a long time looking at the structure, at the stone cylinder with its lumpy sod roof, at the smoke rising steady from the chimney, at the evidence that someone had survived in a place where survival should have been impossible. He stood there long enough that Margaret saw him from inside and came to the door. "Mr. Kruger." He nodded, said nothing, just studied the building with the eye of a man who had spent 40 years working stone and thought he understood what stone could do. "May I come inside?" Margaret stepped back. He ducked through the doorway and stood in the center of the circular space. The interior was 52 degrees. Comfortable. Emma was playing with a rag doll in the corner. Daniel was sleeping under a blanket. Benjamin was nursing content and fever-free. Kruger placed his palm against the wall, held it there, moved it to a different spot, testing the temperature at various heights, various distances from the stove. "The walls are 2 feet thick," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact he was re-examining. 22 inches, Yes, I knew that. He walked the perimeter, examining the roof construction, the chimney placement, the stove position, the way the space was organized. Professional assessment of work that should not have succeeded. The roof is crude, he said, but it held through 60-mile-per-hour winds. I did not expect that. Sod is heavier than you would think, and the beams were solid oak. He looked up at the blackened timbers, at the overlapping layers of prairie sod, at engineering that had been accomplished with salvage materials and desperation and no formal training. The space is small. I thought that was a weakness. Small space means less air to heat. Yes. He turned slowly, taking in the room. The mattresses pressed against the curved walls, the rope shelves, the stove with its pipe rising through the stone. 4 people living in a space smaller than most kitchens. I was wrong about that. He stood with his hands still on the stone. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Not the voice of authority delivering verdicts. The voice of a student encountering something that challenged everything he thought he knew. I told you that you would freeze in this thing. I told you that you would kill your children. He looked at Emma, at Daniel, at Benjamin nursing peacefully. I was wrong. The words came simple, factual, no excuses, no qualifications. A master stonemason who had built 14 houses admitting that a widow with no training had found something he had missed. The stone holds the heat, he said, almost to himself. Like a clay pot holds water. The more mass, the more memory. And the round shape. He walked to the wall and pressed both palms against it. There are no corners for the wind to find, no weak points. The air moves around it instead of pushing through. He had known these principles. Every stonemason knew them. But he had never applied them this way. Had never considered that small and round and thick might be superior to large and square and moderately thick. He turned to Margaret. Others will want to know how you did this. The Larsons lost their cow keeping warm. The family north of the Brenners. He stopped. Others will want to know. Then I will show them. I have no secrets. Kruger nodded, looked at the walls one more time, at the impossible structure that had saved 4 lives when every calculation said it should have been a tomb. Your husband was a careful man, he said. He laid a good foundation. He would be proud of what you built on it. He left before she could respond, climbed into his wagon and drove away across the snow-covered prairie. Margaret stood in this doorway and watched him go. The man who had told her she would die here, who had calculated her failure with absolute certainty. He had been wrong, and he had been man enough to admit it. Clara Morgan came a week later. She had not left Kansas after all. Had been living in Hays with relatives, waiting, watching, wondering what would happen to the granary her husband had built, and the woman who had dared to try to live in it. She walked around the structure twice, touched the walls, examined the sod roof, looked at the chimney hole with professional interest. When she finally came inside, her face held something that had not been there when Margaret had last seen her. Not hope exactly, but the absence of despair. My husband and I built this for wheat, she said, looking around the circular space, at the stove, at the children. at the evidence that someone was actually living here. We never thought of it as a house. Neither did I, Margaret said, until I had no choice. Clara sat on an overturned bucket, watched the fire crackling in the stove, the flames reflected in her eyes. I said you would suffocate or freeze. I said the walls would not save you. You were not wrong to doubt. I doubted too. But you did it anyway. I had 3 children and no alternatives. Clara was silent for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. The bitterness that had been so sharp when they last spoke was gone, worn away by months of living with relatives who did not want her there, of sleeping in corners and working for her keep and knowing that she had given up something her husband had died building. I'm thinking of filing a new claim, she said, finally. A small place, just for me. Would you? She stopped, started again. Would you teach me how you built the roof? How you cut the chimney? Margaret stood and took Clara's hand. I will show you everything, and you will help me show others. They spent the afternoon drawing diagrams in the dirt floor, discussing angles and measurements, the principle that Margaret's grandmother had called Sonnengedächtnis, the sun's memory. By the time Clara left, she had the beginnings of a plan. And Margaret had something she had not had since Thomas died. An ally. Reverend Samuel Porter did not visit Margaret after the storm. He addressed his congregation instead. From the safety of his pulpit on the Sunday after the roads were cleared, God in his wisdom preserved the Brennan family from the storm, he announced, voice carrying through the small church. Let us not presume that this was human wisdom. Let us remember that God moves in mysterious ways, and that what appeared to be foolishness was merely his instrument. He did not acknowledge that he had predicted her death, did not acknowledge that he had threatened to separate her children, did not acknowledge that every word he had spoken to her had been calculated to break her will and force her into a marriage that would have transferred her claim to another man. But when Margaret walked into church that Sunday, the first time since Thomas's funeral, the community's response told her everything she needed to know. The women who had refused to help now nodded in greeting, not warm, not welcoming exactly, but acknowledging her presence in a way they had not done since she became a widow. The men who had taken Thomas's tools looked away, unable to meet her eyes, unable to reconcile what they had done with what she had accomplished despite them. Marcus Webb sat in the back pew, the widower who was supposed to marry her, provide for her, save her from her own foolish pride. He did not approach her after the service, did not speak to her, never spoke to her again. Reverend Porter had lost his power. The woman who was supposed to fail had succeeded. And in succeeding, she had proven that his certainty was not divine wisdom, but simply the assumptions of men who could not imagine women accomplishing what they themselves found difficult. Margaret did not demand apologies, did not seek vindication, just sat in the church with her children and listened to the sermon and knew that something fundamental had shifted. She had changed the calculation, and calculations once changed could not be unchanged. By the spring of 1889, 7 stone structures modeled on Margaret's design stood in Rush County. Heinrich Kruger built 3 of them himself, each one smaller than the square houses he had built before, each one with thicker walls, each one circular or with rounded corners to deflect wind. The designs varied, Some were rectangular with curves. Some were fully circular, like the original. But all shared the principles Margaret had proven. Thick stone walls, small interior volume, heavy roofs, thermal mass as the primary heating mechanism instead of constant fuel consumption. Margaret showed every family who asked, drew diagrams, explained the sun's memory, demonstrated how the walls absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, how the circular shape shed wind, how less space meant less fuel. She never asked for payment, never charged for the knowledge she shared. The method spread beyond Rush County. Settlers in Barton County heard the story and came to see. Families in Ness County, Ellis County. Some adapted the design for their own needs. Half-buried structures that used earth as additional thermal mass. Stone cellars with living spaces above. Variations on the principle. The mathematics were simple enough that anyone could understand them. Thick walls remembered. Small spaces required less heat. Circular shapes deflected wind. Margaret Brennan had proven it with $2 a burn grain silo, and the refusal to accept that the mathematics everyone else calculated actually applied to her situation. She proved up her claim in 1892, 5 years after Thomas's death. The land transferred to her name, 160 acres that were hers, by right of continuous residence and improvement. She never remarried. She expanded the stone granary twice, added a stone-walled addition for the children as they grew, built a separate stone kitchen with the same thick walls and circular design. The compound grew organically, each addition following the principles she had learned during that first desperate autumn. She lived on the claim until her death in 1917, 59 years old, long enough to see her children grown, long enough to see the method she had pioneered adopted across the plains, long enough to know that she had changed something fundamental about how people thought about survival in this unforgiving place. Emma Brennan married a farmer from Ness County in 1903. She built her own stone house on her husband's claim. Circular, thick-walled. Her mother's design refined by 20 years of observation and adjustment. Daniel Brennan took over the homestead when Margaret's health began to fail. Farmed the land his father had died trying to prove up. Raised his own family in the stone compound his mother had built from salvage and desperation. Benjamin Brennan became a schoolteacher in Hayes. The infant who had burned with fever through the worst night of the children's blizzard lived until 1961. 83 years old. Long enough to see the automobile replace the horse. Long enough to see electricity come to the plains. Long enough to tell his grandchildren about the winter his mother bought a burned silo for $2 and kept her family alive with mathematics and stone. The original granary stood until 1943. By then, it was just an oddity. An old stone cylinder on land that had been sold and resold. The new owners needed space for a modern grain elevator. The old stone structure was in the way. They demolished it. Sledgehammers and determination. The limestone that had survived 100 Kansas winters came down in a week. The stones were carried away. Used to build a fence along the property line. The fence still stands. On a clear day, if you know where to look, you can see it running across the prairie. Limestone blocks stacked 3 feet high, 22 inches thick at the base. The same stones that Carl Morgan cut and laid for a granary that was supposed to store wheat for 100 years. The same stones that kept 3 children alive on January 12, 1888, when the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours, and 235 people died because the buildings they trusted could not hold heat the way stone holds memory. Margaret Brennan bought a burned silo for $2. Everyone calculated she would freeze. They used the wrong math. The walls were thick. The space was small. The shape deflected wind. And when the fire went out at midnight on the coldest night in Kansas history, the limestone gave back what it had stored. Not much. Not enough to be comfortable. Just enough. 32 degrees. The exact mathematical minimum for human survival. The walls had calculated it perfectly, because thick walls remember, and remembering was enough.